The Entrepreneur's Library, episode 127.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur's Library, the only book-centric podcast that reviews all the top-selling business books and shares authors' perspective firsthand. This is your resource to finding the next great book that will enable you to grow personally and professionally. Welcome your host, Wade Danielson.
Welcome back to the EL. Today we have John A. Goodman, author of Customer Experience 3.0. High Profit Strategies in the Age of Techno Service. Welcome, John, and thank you for joining us on the Entrepreneur's Library.
My pleasure.
Before we dive into the book, will you take just a second to introduce yourself and tell us just a little bit about you personally?
Okay, well, I'm an engineer by trade and have been in this business for about 40 years. And we actually started out as an ad hoc student group in the basement of Harvard Law School and have yet to get real jobs. And our first project as a student group was for Elliot Richardson, who was the secretary of HEW and then the attorney general under Richard Nixon. And he asked us to look at consumer involvement in government programs. And from there, we got a large project to do a national cross-section survey of the U.S. population where we found that most consumers, when they have a problem, don't complain. But if they do complain and are satisfied, they're more loyal. And that actually was the genesis of the GE Answer Center and the use of 800 numbers for customer service. So we started out doing research for the government and since then have worked with about 45 of the Fortune 100 and a bunch of nonprofits in 17 countries around the world. So we've worked literally in every industry in enhancing customer service and then the customer experience.
Wow. That is excellent. So thank you for sharing that. And let's jump right into your book, which covers that topic, Customer Experience 3.0, and which was made available not that long ago, actually July 20th, 2014. And John, we're going to move quickly, but we're here to cover the top questions that our listener/future reader would like to get answered. And the first one is, what was the inspiration behind writing Customer Experience 3.0?
Well, in 2009, I had written a book, Strategic Customer Service, which was how companies needed to array their operations to deliver really good customer service. And then in the subsequent 5 years, I saw technology coming in so many areas that I felt I really had to update it. And so I was going to write about customer experience. Then I found that Joe Pine had written a book, Customer Experience, in the 1990s, where he had defined customer experience as wowing customers. Then IBM came out talking about Customer Experience 2.0, which is using CRM systems to tailor the offer to the customer. So I had to name mine Customer Experience 3.0, which is end-to-end customer experience, and it's becoming preventive, proactive, and creating emotional connection.
So what makes your book different from others regarding the same or similar topic?
Well, really in 3 or 4 ways. First of all, we find that everyone talks about customer service and customer experience is really good because you'll win more customers, but there's no quantification done in a way that finance guys will ever agree to it. And in fact, everyone talks about Nordstrom's taking back tires when they didn't sell tires, which is a story that actually did happen. But that's done a huge disservice to customer experience because every finance guy hears that story and says, well, that's on the face of it a stupid idea. If you do that very much, you're going to go out of business. So in fact, the Nordstrom story of wowing customers, in fact, convinces finance guys that this is a really bad investment. So the book is aimed heavily at how do you quantify the payoff of better service and quality and customer experience in a way finance will actually accept. And in round numbers, our data shows that the revenue and word-of-mouth payoff of better service and quality are 10 to 20 times the investment, so it becomes very compelling. The other thing is that all the new technology has now allowed one to deliver great service and wow the customer at very low expense. And I've come up with a term I call psychic pizza, which is I ring your doorbell and say, here is the pizza you were about to order. If I can anticipate technologically what your next request is going to be, and I deliver that information or that service 10 seconds before you ask for it, I dazzle your socks off and dramatically cut my costs. So really focusing on the financial implications and how one intelligently implements technology are probably two of the key focal points. And the third is that people need to empower the front line in a way that in no transactions does the supervisor have to become involved. We find that now people don't trust the front line, and that's a huge mistake because most of the people come to work desperately wanting to do a good job and are really very effective at delivering service if you allow them some creativity and flexibility.
John, how do you suggest the reader engage with your book? Is this one that you designed to be read from front to back, or can the reader jump in and jump out based on the information they need at that time?
Well, you can jump in and jump out, but to sort of give yourself the ammunition you need to get finance and marketing to really invest with you and become enthusiastic about it, it does make sense to read it from front to back. And the very first chapter is knocking down all the myths that finance and marketing use to say we don't really need to worry about investing more in the customer experience. And three of those myths are: no news is good news, wrong, because most customers don't complain. The customer is always right. Wrong. In fact, we find customers cause 30% of all their own problems, but if you correctly onboard them and educate them, you can help them avoid most of those problems and delight them in the same action. And also the perception that great service costs more than good service. So we basically knocked down about a half a dozen myths that stand in the way of people really implementing very effectively.
Excellent. So, John, we're to my favorite part of the entire interview. And that's why I want to hand over the mic and really allow you to give the reader an excellent / listener, an excellent idea of what your book's all about. Will you take the next couple minutes and do that?
Okay, absolutely. And again, the first chapter is why good service might not result in a great experience, and that's knocking down all the myths that everybody brings to the customer experience arena. The second is that service is more than people. It's more than smiling and being courteous. There has to be really good processes because most of your staff are implementing processes, and if they're constrained by that, then they are backed into the corner of, well, sir, I'd like to do that, but I can't because. And then also having the technology to both make the front line intelligent, but also delivering the psychic pizza. Because wowing the customer one person at a time, face to face, is really expensive. But now with technology, you can wow lots of customers and get ahead of the game in many, many cases. So it's basically setting the stage that you need to have technology and processes that support the people. The third chapter is winning over the chief financial officer, what I call the resident financial cynic. And we show how you can quantify not only the revenue payoff of better service and quality, but also word of mouth, because really successful companies have very positive word of mouth. For instance, with Harley Davidson and Chick-fil-A and the Cheesecake Factory, more than 70% of all their new customers are brought in by existing customers. So sales and marketing need to do very little because your customers are doing your marketing for you. Also, if you have a really great customer experience, you can charge a premium for your product, and one can quantify the enhanced margin that you achieve via great customer experience. So that's chapter 3, is winning over and convincing the CFO. Chapter 4 is, all right, how do you deliver a great product the first time, doing it right the first time? And that entails setting proper customer expectations. While I mentioned earlier that customers cause 30% of all their own problems, we find sales and marketing cause another 30% of the problems because they are afraid to warn the customer about the potential problems with a product or the limitations, and they really don't want to spend the time educating or onboarding the customer. So doing it right the first time is setting proper expectations and then educating the customer how to get the most value out of their product. And with all the technology nowadays, we are finding that consumers don't read the directions. No one does, whether it's business to business or consumers. And they're only getting 1/3 of the functionality of the product. So one thing that a number of companies are doing is reaching out and saying, we notice you're not using these 4 functions of the product. Here's a 1-minute video that will show you how to use this function. And we find that people have a 1-minute attention span, so a short video will get them to use that function, at which point they're now getting more value from the product. The next step is, once you've delivered the product, is getting the customer to reach out to you when they have questions or problems. And this is what we call access. And everyone says that access to service is answering the phone really fast. Well, there's a prerequisite. Our data shows that 3/4 of customers who have questions or problems never contact the company because it's too much trouble, you're not going to help me anyway, or you're going to tell me I'm stupid, or you're going to argue with me. Fear of conflict. And so one needs to break down the barriers, and the best way of doing that is to have a message in front of the customer exactly when he incurs the problem or question, which is, we can only solve problems we know about. Here's how to contact us via all the different channels. And you really do need to have all the channels available and be available wide hours. For instance, when we set up the original Apple helpline, we had a peak at 2 a.m. because that's when the techno geeks are actually most active. The 6th chapter is, when someone comes to you for service, you want to be sure that you satisfy them. And 2 things that most frontline staff lack are flexibility and clear, believable explanations. People have to create what we call flexible solution spaces, which is not one size fits all, but there are 4 ways of handling this issue depending on the customer's circumstances. And here are 4 stories to illustrate them. And so you give the frontline flexibility. The other part is clear, believable explanations. We find most of the world can articulate the policy, but if the customer then says, well, why do you have that policy? Why can't you do this for me? You get 1 or 2 answers, which is either, look, Mac, that's our policy, which comes across as rudeness, except in New York. Or the other answer is, yeah, that is a stupid policy. I don't know why we do it that way. I work for a stupid company. On the other hand, if I can give you a clear, believable explanation, I can do bad things to you and still retain your loyalty. My favorite example here is that if the airline pilot gets on and says we have a 1-hour delay due to a mechanical, there are a bunch of foul-ups, but if he says we have a leak in the hydraulic system, everyone says, I want a good hydraulic system, take an extra 30 minutes if necessary. We joke at Lexus that when you're saying no to the customer or giving him bad news, the object of the game is to tell the customer to go to hell in such a way that he looks forward to the trip. So we talk about, how do you arm your front line to be able to always satisfy the customer and sometimes dazzle them in terms of what we call cheap delighters. And one last example of that is at Chick-fil-A. They've now hired your grandmother to cruise the dining room, pouring sweet tea and saying, oh, would you like a few more fries? And her job description is to create microbursts of emotional connection. And you can do that in 20 to 40 seconds. The 7th chapter is listen passionately, which is creating a unified voice of the customer. And the big point that I make there is that most organizations say the voice of the customer are their surveys and their complaints. But there are 2 other sources of data that are critically important and in many cases more powerful. The example I always use is FedEx knows 10 hours before you do that the package isn't going to arrive because it missed a flight in Memphis. Then they get the frantic phone call. Then 2 days later, they do the satisfaction survey. My point is the operational data internal to the company is going to tell you what the customer experience is 10 hours before it happens. Very few companies look at their operational data as a descriptor of voice of the customer. And then the 4th piece is the employee input, because again, the employees know real time and in many cases in advance what's going to happen. So we find that those data sources integrated in such a way that they create the economic imperative for action make a voice of the customer system that is dramatically more powerful than the average company has. And in fact, my research shows that about 70% of voice of the customer systems are pretty much ineffective. Then the last 3 chapters of the book focus on three key implementation issues where I see everyone is driven nuts. The first one is taming technology. And here, people want to improve the customer experience, but the CIO says, well, that'll take 4 years and $12 million, which, of course, you don't have. And we have come up with a number of mechanisms for how the customer experience area can play nicely with the IT department. And in fact, the CIOs desperately want to be helpful, but there's not a common language or mechanism for the two groups working together. And I suggest a number of areas there. I also suggest how 10 different technologies can be used to enhance the customer experience. And it's everything from mundane things like the website and CRM to gamification, online communities, and video, we find is one of the most powerful educational devices that is not used very effectively in most organizations. The ninth chapter focuses on empowering the frontline staff and creating emotional connection with the customer and looks a lot at training and incentives, but the most critical factor that doesn't work well in most corporations is the supervisor. And what is the role of the supervisor? It's not catching people doing things wrong, it's recognizing people for doing things right. And then the final chapter is if you aspire to or are actually now the customer experience leader, how do you survive? Because my general experience is that 2/3 of customer experience leaders fail and end up having to justify their existence. And that's because they take on some of the wrong roles. And I suggest 7 roles that a customer experience leader should be performing, but 2 that they should avoid like the plague because they're absolutely keys to disaster. So we start off with a heavy research base. We create the economic imperative for change. We provide a framework for doing it right, getting people to use the service system, having an effective service system, and then a good voice of the customer process. And then we focus on technology, empowerment, and becoming the customer experience leader.
So John, this next question might be kind of difficult because I'm asking you to take all of that last 5 to 8 minutes and put it into a nutshell for us. And the question is, if the reader could only take away one concept, principle, or action out of everything you just discussed and everything that's in your book, what would you want that to be?
Well, I would say that it would be that the revenue and word of mouth implications of a better customer experience are 10 to 20 times the cost required to achieve it. So you're guaranteed 1,000% return if you do your quantification the right way. And so I find greed works really well. And I remember one automobile dealership who said, I think all this customer satisfaction stuff is a bunch of crap, but if it'll make me more money, I'll do it. And that's really the bottom line is the bottom line. And a great customer experience does deliver very effectively on the bottom line.
John, do you have a favorite quote from your book?
Well, I actually have 2. One is actually the wife of a neighbor, where I had been making the point that one small problem with a product will lead to a customer switching brands on a very important purchase. And this guy is a cardiologist, and he uses his iPhone to get medical charts and photographs. And so when he was out buying a new, very high-end car, the big thing he did was make sure that his phone would sync with the car. And one of the high-end brands, there was a syncing problem, which the dealer basically informed him it was his problem, not their problem. And so he went and bought a completely different car. And his wife made the comment, Tom buys his phone because it's a good camera, and he buys his car because it's a good phone. And so I just thought that illustrated that one small detail can derail a $50,000 or $100,000 purchase. The other quote is the title of one of my subchapters, which is that no news is not necessarily good news. Because the vast majority of customers, not just consumers, but also in business to business, never complain because it's too much trouble and they're afraid of conflict, especially in business to business, because if I complain about your sales rep to his boss or your service technician, I got to live with that person, and they're going to come into my business in 2 weeks, and it's going to be very uncomfortable. So we find that no news is not good news, and one really needs to break down barriers and communicate to your customers. We can only solve problems we know about.
So John, it wouldn't be a book podcast if I didn't ask you for a book recommendation. And that's if there was only one book you could recommend to our listeners based on the way that it's impacted your life, maybe created even a paradigm shift for you, what book would you suggest?
Well, again, I'm going to give you two answers. And again, they're old books, but they really do deserve to be reread. The first is In Search of Excellence by Tom Peters. That was the one that really got me thinking in terms of case studies and what are these guys doing differently and what's the difference in mindset. And then the other is Moments of Truth by Jan Carlson in terms of you need to map the entire customer journey end to end and then say, where is it that we have that transaction that is losing the most customers? And if you then quantify that, and I think that's what I've added to the calculus is here's how you actually quantify it in a way that the resident financial cynic will accept it.
So John, before we depart, can you recommend the best way for our listeners to not only get more information on you, but also get more information on your book, Customer Experience 3.0?
Well, you can go to our website, which is Customer Care MC, Matthew Charlie, it's Customer Care Measurement and Consulting.com. And you can also download our latest national RAGE study. Every 2 years, we do a cross-section survey of the U.S. population that looks at what makes customers so angry they start swearing at the company. And A, it's sort of hilarious reading, and everyone will identify with it. But B, it really quantifies the 70 to 80 billion dollars that companies are leaving on the table simply by not aggressively soliciting and handling problems.
Well, John, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your book with us.
Okay, great. And also one other thought is they can follow me on Twitter at jgoodman888.
Thanks again for listening in today. If you'd like more information on John or his book, Customer Experience 3.0, you can look at the show notes at the elpodcast.com.
Looking for your next book idea? Head over to the elpodcast.com, where Wade shares his amazing resource, the top 10 business books recommended by over 500 entrepreneurs with you for free. That's the elpodcast.com. Till the next time, keep it on the EL.